Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Farm. I'm joined today by Stephen Snider and Colin Kerris. Science fiction is the contemporary scry mirror in our deepest desires for the future and possible prophecy of tomorrow's waking reality. We've discussed Doctor Who, Philip K. Dick, and possible prophecy of tomorrow. Nope, Philip K. Dick and others here on the show. So today we focus on Star Trek and the new iteration of this vast mythology, CBS's Picard series. Though many of the uninitiated are convinced Star Trek is yet another disposable pop culture fiction dreamed up for the most nerdy of nerd culture demographics, those who follow the show will identify this catalyst for future technology and veiled mystical beliefs has given a rare voice to a real intelligence contacted by Puharik and the Nine, claiming to at least be the nine Egyptian gods and omnipresent space intelligences, which may have influenced the elite bloodlines present at this channeling to change our historical landscape and the ambitious conquest of space in the real world. Roddenberry canon is the will and philosophy of the Nine, as I've minimally demonstrated, are present in the plots of the Star Trek cartoon. When I reference Roddenberry canon, I mean in and outside of just the world of Star Trek, to all of the visionary projects, including the ones that never saw the light of day. Another theme that has haunted Zero Night's collective sync work since day one is the idea of a cosmic cube, not only the one wielded by Red Skull in the Marvel Universe, but the Allspark in Transformers, Jim Henson's first art project called The Cube. Aqua Teen Hunger Force's talking alien intelligence in the form of a primary colored cube, which pretends at omni-intelligence, even if it is a joke. And finally, the same world-consuming technocratic artificial intelligence, which assimilates sprawling regions of natural places, architectural landscapes, and sentient souls alike, the Borg Cube, making a return in the world of Picard as well. Another theme habitually discussed in years we've been exploring sync as well, the idea of a sleeper cell trauma based mind control super soldier. Super soldiers, in the form they appear in the very beginning of Picard, awaken at only the right time when physically threatened in the exact way we see them jolting awake in the show to promptly combine Special Forces disarms with Krav Maga style close quarters combat to drop multiple enemies surrounding sleeper cell warriors being triggered. As one can see in Salt, Hannah, Manchurian Candidate, Serenity, Captain America, Universal Soldier, Far Cry, and most recently, Bloodshot, besides just Picard, Upgrade, Hitman, Hardcore Harry, Fifth Element, and more. For more on trauma-based mind control sleeper cell super soldiers, visit the blog where I've written extensively on this theme in every medium from a Deathblow Wolverine crossover comic book to every video game based around these ideas. I also authored a short online book on super soldiers in real life, from MK Ultra to Dream Trained Troopers, the likes of which are visualized in the Ender's Game film. So, what are some of the themes you guys were really happy to see come back in Picard from some of the other Star Trek series?
Do you want to take that to start
Oh,
off with, Colin?
sure, yeah. So one of the main things, firstly, I was quite interested in seeing this show, and it was on Amazon Prime here in the UK, and I was watching the first episode when it came out. One of the main things I was taking from it, and I guess specifically as being a long-term Star Trek fan, is the depiction of how the Federation's moral and ethical values have kind of declined, and how that contrasts with what the sort of the opinions of Picard and how he now relates to the Federation, being retired. The Federation has certainly, in this depiction of Star Trek, gone on to become rather isolationist, and that it will not help the beleaguered Romulans, who are pretty much the good guys nowadays, and also how the existence of synthetic life forms or androids, which have been a part of the Trek universe, have been outlawed because of this perceived sort of terrorist attack on Mars, which has been brought on by the androids. I was quite glad that this series is actually, bringing us forwards in the Star Trek timeline as well, and actually taking us beyond the universe of the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager also. Because one of the things I wasn't so cheerful about with more modern incarnations of Star Trek has been the obsession with rolling everything back in time and rebooting. You know, we had, I mean, even going back to the Enterprise series, which tries to predate the classic series, and I don't think was very successful necessarily. And then the reboot movies, and then Discovery, which also goes back. And I haven't watched all of Discovery, but I know it sort of messes around with the timeline and the continuity. So it's interesting to contrast the Picard world as being somewhere that things are more unsure for Star Trek. I mean, obviously it's following on from the lead character of The Next Generation. And I've also been rewatching some Next Gen recently. And of course, The Next Gen was very, I don't want to say dull, but watching Next Gen, it's aged in an interesting way because, you know, all the characters, you know, the Federation, everybody in the organization is essentially perfect. And of course, the characters in the Picard series are very flawed. You know, a lot of them have addiction issues and guilt and various traumas to deal with. And you have Picard joining up with this ragtag gang of dysfunctional characters that are not really anything like the Starfleet officers he would have served with back in the Next Gen world. And you also have... Sorry, go on, Stephen. I was just going.
Well, I was going to say, actually, the original security chief in Next Gen, the blonde-haired chick, actually did have substance abuse problems, but that was prior to her having joined Starfleet, I believe. So at least it was kind of referenced. But yes, the Starfleet officers were kind of made of marble, so to speak. And I just kind of wanted to build on to what you were getting at with the universe. It is a very interesting progression. I believe technically the timeline in this one was supposed to be a combination of the original timeline and the new one that was established with the prequel films, but we don't really get very much of a sense of that. It seems to largely stick to the timeline of the original shows and so on and so forth, and it's a really fascinating continuation, I think, from DS9 to me in a lot of ways. I know Christopher Knowles has, you know, speculated about this a little bit, but he always had felt that DS9 would be difficult for the producers to follow up for several reasons, and certainly it does seem like since it came out, there was an attempt to really avoid getting into the broader Star Trek universe. Of course, you initially had Voyager, which takes place almost entirely in the Delta Quadrant. The classic show, Next Generation, DS9, they're all pretty much in the Alpha and the Beta quadrants. So you don't really see very much about what is going on in the Federation itself in Voyager after DS9 had ended. And then, of course, Enterprise, as Colin just alluded to, was a prequel to the original series, and then going into the new films and so forth in this decade, I should say. They're pretty much all prequels and that type of thing. And the world we saw in DS9 was already kind of beginning to offer a much more cynical depiction of the Starfleet universe, especially in terms of the Maquis and so forth, who had just essentially been abandoned to the tender mercies of the Cardassians at the onset of DS9. So you were already kind of seeing the cracks in the armor, so to speak, and then the whole just period depicted in DS9 was one of almost perpetual warfare with the Klingons, with the what was it, the Foundation or whatever the big one was called there, the Cardassians. So Starfleet had just been really exhausted by these wars that carried out throughout the timeline of DS9, and this was even alluded to in one of the Next Gen movies. I believe it was the one after First Contact, where Picard says something to the effect of, like, you know, we used to explore and now all we do is just fight battles, or something to that effect. So I mean, I know a lot of people will probably read into Picard as being a commentary on Trump's excuse me, on Trump's America with the isolationism and so forth. Sorry. And certainly it is, but I mean, I kind of feel like it's also in a lot of ways a logical continuation of the universe that was depicted in DS9. The Federation had just fought numerous, enormous battles with the Borg, with the Foundation, with the Cardassians, the Klingons. I mean, pretty much anyone you can think of. The Federation was really starting to seem to be spent and exhausted by the time the DS9 was wrapping up. And I mean, you can only imagine the perspective it would have been in after this alleged attack by the androids at the onset of the period that's being depicted in the Picard show. So it is interesting to me how they did kind of wrap this into the older shows in a really compelling fashion that's also relevant with current political events as well.
Yeah, because I mean, because it is effectively 20. It has moved forward in real time from when we left off. Like with, I think, Nemesis, the movie Nemesis, being the last time we saw any of the next gen people. So it is like roughly 20 years later. And yeah, as you raised there about it being about Trump's America, or I mean, I think these are very clear things. You see, there's the issues with immigration and the fact that the Federation are doing nothing to help the Romulans, who are now the sort of the underclass because their world's been destroyed. And yeah, I mean, one thing, I mean, I have been following sort of the sort of the internet's opinion of this show since it came back. And certainly, I've noticed a lot of criticism of the perceived identity politics of the show, and you have a lot of these right-wing vloggers getting incensed about the preachiness of the show or about it being too woke, because, of course, wokeness is the blight of the internet. And if you look at Patrick Stewart himself, I mean, he's credited as an executive producer on this show, which would suggest to me, he would have had a hand in the overall sort of direction and of what the writers were talking about. And he's, spoken out against Brexit. So obviously that means the whole show could as much be about Brexit as Trump's America.
I think
And
sometimes people are really overanalyzing. I think the anti-woke fanboy crowd is really constantly searching now for any new adaptation to be like obsessed or just sort of one-minded about wokeness. But I really feel like you guys are saying there's multiple interpretations. It could be any American president or general during wartime who makes as many genuinely, good moral decisions that are hard to make decisions, but there's still a body count. There's still someone who suffers. And I just feel it really kind of reflects anyone, like a military general or president, like I'm saying, who has to make a kind of decision on, okay, in order to save these millions of lives, we might have to, accidentally take out a few civilians here. Now, I'm not trying to say that modern wars have the same moral decision making, because of course with predator drones and everything else, we have a few presidents in line now that were just okay with killing all sorts of people, seemingly, with a hands-off approach with drones where, I don't think people actually needed to die, and there are moral problems there. But my point is, I saw this show as left very open and universal about these moral decisions. I really didn't feel like it had, like a gay or trans agenda that they were shoving down our throat. It's just the kind of diversity you're going to pick up in science fiction like Star Trek or Star Wars generally,
Yeah,
well,
no, I
that
didn't. I didn't really think. Sorry to cut you off for a second, Colin, but yeah, I mean, I didn't really find it to be especially preachy. I mean, the depiction of isolation in it does irk me somewhat because it's kind of in keeping with how this type of thing is normally depicted, where, if a major military power doesn't deploy troops, it's always going to be a disaster. But on the flip side of the coin, that's about par of the course, with this type of venue in general. And as I, had been alluding to earlier, I don't think that it's out of keeping with what had been established in DS9. I mean, clearly the Federation already kind of seemed like it was going into decline by the end of that show, and I really think the extreme isolationism depicted in Picard would have been a natural offshoot of what we were seeing in DS9. So, and that's, to me, that's what really usually bothers me about wokeness in, movies and TV shows and what have you. It's when they just kind of try to incorporate it into a context where it makes no sense whatsoever, where there was no foreshadowing or anything like that of it. Whereas, in Picard, I really do think that, the seeds of this had been laid in DS9, if we're being perfectly honest. So,
Yeah,
Colin, what were you going to say?
Oh, yeah, Colin, I'm gonna let you go in 1 second, but they didn't make Picard a, gay black woman. They didn't change anything with any real forced, sort of violence that would be very upsetting. I'm sorry, Colin, what were you about to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As you were saying, I mean, Stephen, with it being a plausible future that takes place, in the wake of everything that happened in Deep Space Nine with regards to the flow of history and, organizations coming into decline. But yeah, as with the whole wokeness, blah blah blah, I mean, a lot of that is down to the internet age and the fact that everything that exists, every like art, every sort of science fiction thing that comes out now is so heavily scrutinized and dissected by everybody who has an opinion can just put it out there. So, I mean, obviously, and that's always been, as you're saying about inclusivity or multiculturalism, that's always been at the heart of Star Trek. You sort of want to say to these people who are saying, "Oh, how dare the cast be multicultural? It's just, it's PC, god mad, lefty liberals ruining our science fiction, and it's politicizing." But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it's like,
that's utterly ridiculous. I mean, even going back to the original series, I mean, they had an African American woman in a very prominent role. They had a major character who was a Russian at the, really, I mean, not quite the apex of the Cold War, but very close to it. And certainly, I mean, that kind of diversity continued on to all of the shows beginning in the late 80s and going through the 90s and the early noughts as well. So, yeah, I mean, that's, of all the franchises, criticizing Star Trek for diversity is just, it's like criticizing speeding at the Indy 500 or something. It's just absurd.
And Uhura, I mean, really did break open these stereotypes in these places that Black people in general weren't allowed to go in television shows. So not only was she a woman, but a person of color, so to speak, in those older terms. And it was so influential that multiple shows at the time were allowed to change because of Roddenberry's willingness to fight for Uhura as, a main prominent and a strong character. And a good thermometer for that is the fact that Martin Luther King stepped in when Uhura was when the actress was doubting her usefulness and maybe she was being used in a kind of way, and so much controversy that was being thrown her way, perhaps by fans. Martin Luther King actually stepped in and had a talk with her, and that's why we have Uhura for the rest of that show. But besides all that, it was one of the first on-screen interracial kissing
Kisses,
scenes,
yeah.
which is maybe Kirk got enough of the ladies, and that's a kind of chauvinistic, annoying point in and of itself. But just to isolate that point that it was, a huge step for Black people, a huge step for Black women, and interracial, the idea of interracial love.
Probably, I mean, female athletes to a certain extent too. I mean, I noticed when I was rewatching with my wife, Uhura was ripped in that show. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a woman that had a six pack like she did in that series. But yeah, and on top of that too, with DS9, I believe that was also it was DS9 or Voyager, which was the first same-sex on-screen kiss. I can't
oh,
remember
well,
which one.
I was just about to mention that. Yeah, that would be Deep Space Nine. So that was the episode. I can't remember the title, but it was the one dealing with Dax exploring her other lives. And Dax is a character who, is a classic example of Star Trek using science fiction and futuristic scenarios to explore issues, because Dax is a woman who used to be a man, for science fiction reasons. And in that episode, yeah, I mean, I think they were always trying to push those sort of issues, but very often, because of, I imagine, various network regulations, if you look back at the sort of the 90s Trek, they couldn't get away with. But that one episode where Dax, kisses a woman who was her ex, I believe, and of course, it's okay because Dax, was a man when she went out with him, so it's fine.
And if Star Trek was, able to do that in all these different iterations of Star Trek and all the different series, it's kind of, breaking down walls around stereotypes and what's allowed by the censors or what's allowed by the culture. People have to understand, especially millennial age people and younger, that was pure bravery. That was something you actually needed to fight for at that time. Whereas now, fans are annoyed by something that's been habitually shoved down their throat as part of sort of a corporate attempting to align itself with PC culture. So there's a very different energy in those other shows, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Stephen, I thought something you might be more interested in was this concept of the Romulan. Well, actually, we see two sort of Romulan secret societies in Picard. We have the Zhat Vash, who I suppose you could call them a mystery cult to an extent, and they have this, one Romulan woman who's been driven insane by prophecies of apocalypse, which the cult introduced her to, which is something that randomly reminded me of the Millennium season 2 finale more than anything else. And we also see her using like an occult divining tool, which is pretty much like a Romulan version of the tarot. So I wonder if you had any sort of thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean it's very fascinating, and certainly it's really this was kind of to me one of the more striking aspects about Picard as well, is just the fact that it's really in a lot of levels such a conspiratorial show, which is really, I would say, a typical of the Star Trek franchise, and really in a lot of ways I would say is quite brave in this day and age. I mean, conspiracy theories have really come under such an assault in the era of Trump, and especially in recent months and so forth with the COVID-19 thing and what have you. But in Picard, you're essentially seeing a depiction of a secret society within a secret society, the kind of broader one being the Tal Shiar, and then there's the what was it pronounced again?
I think it's Zhat de Vache, but
The Jacques de Vache,
something like
yes.
that.
Yes. I mean, it's kind of this even more secretive secret society within their security services, which, effectively stages a false flag attack that they tried to blame on the synthetics, and that really is the gist for all of this that's unfolding. And this is of course part of a broader plot, as you're alluding to. They had this prophecy that's come to them, I believe, quite a considerable time ago, that synthetic life forms would eventually bring about the end of all organic life in the galaxy. And it's not even just the one woman that was driven nuts by it. I think we've seen the one kind of initiation ceremony where, I mean, almost everybody was driven insane by what they were seeing. I think they were like clawing their eyeballs out, and just I mean, really it's quite horrendous. And I mean, you do have these, as you're alluding to, these elements of the mystery schools here, given the ties that they have to intelligence. I mean, you could almost maybe look at this as kind of a Mithric cult or something to that effect. Certainly there's a certain warrior element to all of it. And I mean, it was a very bold choice, I think, to go with this, and especially so early in the show as well. And I mean, I think there had been a few other kind of mysterious groups depicted at times in Star Trek, occasionally within the Federation. And that's kind of another interesting thing about this too, is there's hints throughout it whether or not how complicit the Federation is in all of this as well. And I kind of think that's something that they could build on going into the second season. So that's another kind of interesting spin on the typical, things that we usually see in a Star Trek franchise. Now you see these conspiracies and potentially Starfleet itself being a part of these elaborate conspiracies, which is, I would say, very new in this universe. And just on a personal level too, I mean, this actually, I think, made the plot line of the character Raffi all the more touching. As you sort of go and watch the show, you learn that she had become very estranged from her only son and presumably her husband as well, because I believe she was Picard's chief of intelligence or something to that effect. They never really spelled it out, but that's the sense that you get, that she was an intelligence officer. And she had uncovered the fact that there was a false flag being staged, that the Federation had been complicit in it in some level. And she had lost everything over this, most especially her relationship with her son. There's that just really heart-wrenching scene about midway through the series where she tries to go visit him. She had a major substance abuse problem. She's cleaned up. She's all happy to finally go and show her son that she's sober again. They have that brief chat, and then he starts asking her about the tax and her theories, and she just can't hold back. And that pretty much brings a kind of permanent separation between her and her son. So, I mean, I'm sure that's, probably a sense something that we could all really relate to.
Yeah, and even with Picard himself, because as I was watching the show, I was sort of thinking, I got to a point where I was thinking, this isn't the same Picard. And that's what another criticism that people have thrown at it, saying, "Oh, Patrick Stewart, he's too old for this." But I mean, it's the same guy, because this is what's happened to him 20 years later. He also, like Raffi, and of course, I think the reason Raffi gets the boot from Starfleet is because she sided with Picard when he sort of noticed something was not going right.
Well, yeah, that was I think, yeah, he tendered his resignation or something, and then like
Yeah.
within minutes of that, she gets a call from her
Yeah.
the commanding officer, which basically leads to the end of her career. So yeah, yes, very tragic there. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Colin.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Picard was always he was the hero of Star Trek, in that he was the perfect diplomat, he was the negotiator, he was the peace broker, he was the debater, all these things. He would be first and forefront in attempting to solve the problems. But certainly in this show, he becomes, he's a lot more disenfranchised. He's sort of been interestingly removed from the conversation in a way. And again, this gets back into the whole identity politics controversy that everybody seems to bring up, is the fact that a lot of times Picard is trying to get something done in this series, and basically a number of women just tell him no, including the Starfleet admiral, who tells him to F off like twice. Which is such a jarring thing to see somebody swearing explicitly in a Star Trek series. For me still, I'm used to the days when nobody ever said a rude word in Star Trek. But yeah, Picard is and then he almost becomes like the reluctant hero. He needs to rise back up to recapture what he used to be in the good old days, when the Federation was a bastion of truth and liberty and free thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't even really think it's Picard so much that's changed. It's really just more the universe that he lives in that
the whole
just changed. I
everything,
mean,
yeah.
Picard is essentially a pillar of integrity, and this is what, he also values with people around him, with his crew and so on and so forth. And he is still going by the mindset that integrity is what really matters in Starfleet, which I think is what spurred him to offer his resignation. And that one scene, because he never thought that they would accept it. This is Starfleet. They're about honor and integrity. They're going to do the right thing instead of what's easy. And yes, he kind of learned the hard way there that that's not, the Starfleet that this isn't the Starfleet that you grew up in. They are going to do what's most convenient for them. And that's really driven home, really throughout the series. You definitely see that kind of degradation, like you're talking about, with the profanity and just the fact that there's no longer really this sense to aspire towards higher values in Starfleet that was always present throughout the other series, essentially. And it's, I can see why a lot of the fanboys were upset about it, but I, for one, think that it makes it even more intriguing, honestly.
And even just the way television has changed and the way television is made now. I mean, of course, this is a limited, self-contained series, which, sure, it's part of the wider universe, but it's a 10-episode series that stands alone. And yeah, people drink, people swear, people take drugs. And certainly looking back to the old days of Star Trek, when they'd make 26 episodes a year, and it was very much self-contained, obviously there has to be kind of a themes and concepts that run through the whole series. So and also with Picard's championing of artificial intelligence and synthetic life, which is another through line of this series, particularly with reference to, we've got Soji, who's the android girl who isn't an android. She has been, part of this. Essentially, they're like a new race, really, of the synthetics. And I think it's interesting, like the whole quest to get to the synth world and essentially find out what's going on with these android people. And that in itself is a sort of conspiracy, because we're sort of thinking that they've ran away to hide essentially the synthetic people. And when we finally get to their planet, it's interesting how they're depicted, I think, because when they first appear, they kind of resemble a sort of a post-human, post-AI singularity version of a sort of a new utopian society where humanity and technology and indeed human and machine intelligence have been perfectly integrated. And that turns out to be false, right? So briefly, they seem like this beautiful, happy culture of, android integrated people, but then they want to come back and eradicate all non-synthetic life, which kind of brings us back around in the sort of synchronicity way to sort of conspiracy theories about evil artificial intelligences that are plotting to control our society,
Well,
and then yeah.
Well, it's also interesting from a mythological standpoint as well, because I mean, I think there really is kind of shades of the story of Cain and Abel and the, synthetic utopia, where I mean, again, one of the things that, well, I mean, obviously it wasn't the thing that led to the downfall, but one of the things that kind of further perverted paradise was the murder of Abel by his brother Cain. And you see that in this series as well. Of course, in this case, it was the one chick who essentially murdered her sister, more or less. And that even was kind of the turning point for Sung, the son of Data's creator, who's also played by Brent Spiner. Up to that point, he's a human, and he had been, more than happy to collaborate with them, potentially helping them bring about the end of humanity, until he sees that they are themselves capable of murdering one another. And, it's kind of a startling realization to him that this isn't a utopian society anymore.
Yeah,
So I do kind of find that fascinating, with the reverberations of the first murder in this, in this social order, and how it does kind of play into the alleged first human murder as well.
yeah,
Yeah, because they're
Colin.
sorry, I was just going to say they're twins, right? The android people. So yeah.
Yeah, Colin, you probably want to expand on this idea, but I was also reminded, I mean, mythologically, of ideas like the golem and so forth. But as far as science fiction and sync is concerned, you kind of are playing with two different stories we're familiar with in sci-fi. So in the Animatrix, which is just a really, really great animated series made out of the Matrix mythology that shows sort of decades going by with what happens with our relationship with AI. And we build a utopia, and that's through using humanoid synthetic cyborgs, sort of, or just robots rather, to clean our houses and to bring us drinks and bars and basically do all the menial tasks and jobs. So in the Animatrix, they show this very lit up utopia where everyone's really happy and celebrating and everyone has a much improved quality of life with these millions of robots serving all of us, and the robots seem to have no problem with it. And finally, after a bunch of physical and, if I remember correctly, like sexual abuse, this one, like everybody has their own sort of personal slave robot, their own kind of what's the word I'm looking for when you employ someone to bring you drinks and fix everything around your house, a butler. So it's this idea like Tomb Raider's Lara Croft's butler. So this one butler is constantly abused and beaten up and talked down to by his or her owner. And then finally, it kind of flips out and malfunctions and murders the person that owns it or bought it. And so then all of a sudden we change all of our legislation and every way we interface with the robots. Now they're evil and they're not to be trusted, and they're just like any human group that we have a prejudice or hatreds towards. The whole consciousness shifts in the way we interact from just one robot freaking out and murdering their master, and then robots are beaten and raped in the street and so forth in this very violent little montage they show in the Animatrix. So we go from a utopia to ultimately blocking out the sun and destroying ourselves because of that one murder that takes place. Even though the robots meet us in the UN and try to explain they want to help us build a better world together and everything, we already don't like the word together because of the paranoia and the fear we have from this golem we've created. And it turns into a Terminator scenario, but that's the other side of the spectrum, Terminator. So I thought they were playing with these ideas sort of in between the utopia and the robots being super helpful and as sort of golem as slaves, to, one step further, it could be they're walking on our bones and ashes and taking over the world with machine guns, the way we see it in Skynet, and how close in the real world are we to that singularity and things. It was kind of a play between that and the idea of super soldiers, the idea of making individual humans like the golem and implanting personalities after trauma-based mind control. And so you have one personality that thinks it's human, wants to fall in love, goes to college, whatever. But the moment you start pointing the barrel of rifles at it, it'll, kill 5 people in a few seconds, basically, the way that that scene starts off where the three, after they kill her boyfriend, the 5 different
The
guys sort of.
Romulans, yeah, from the Order, try to apprehend her, and it does not go well for them.
Right, and they look exactly like DARPA projected this the future soldier would look like. I mean, all the way down to the kind of reflective motorcycle helmet and the kind of bulletproof all black suit, even their rifle, everything looks exactly like those DARPA super soldiers that were projected in like 2007 or whatever. But DARPA gave us a photograph of somebody wearing all that gear, and it's precisely what the Romulans look like.
Well, it's, another interesting thing about the depiction of synthetics in the Picard universe. When we're seeing the abuse that's heaped upon them, it's largely through the prism of what's being done to XBs, the ex-Borgs, and you see this especially, well, not just on the artifact, but really, throughout the whole season. Of course, there's the one really horrific scene. I think it's at the beginning of the 4th or 5th episode where you kind of learn the fate of Ichip, who was really, essentially 7 of 9's son, more or less, and he was dismantled by, hunters for this Borg tech, and it's really quite horrendous. And it's very interesting that they would pick the Borg to really be symbolic of this abuse as well, because of course the Borg are one of the great villains in the Star Trek franchise, and they're just total drones, more or less, devoid of all personality. These just frightening, almost inhuman figures, and Picard really self-consciously set out, I think, to humanize them. There's even that one scene where Picard essentially says something like, "We're finally seeing what the Borg really are underneath. They're victims just like everybody else." And it's certainly it's a very interesting turn, and it is really I think great in a lot of levels that they did take such a stereotypical villain and give them this humanity, and then use that as a prism to see just how horrendous the synthetic ban has been on a lot of levels, even to, in this case, creatures that are still largely nominally organic or human or whatever you want to call it.
And whenever you have the idea of the cube in science fiction, I said it rather rapidly in the intro, but just to review real quick, in every form of fiction where you bring up all these themes at once, you have a cube that's floating through space, exactly like the Borg's kind of spaceship is, and then it goes to a planet and begins to assimilate all natural life into synthetic life. And in the X-Men, you have a certain individual who is synonymous with an entire disease that's a type of technology that wraps itself over the real, whether that be architecture or trees or living things. So in X-Men and Excalibur, you have a character named Warlock, which is strange because that's a magic user in old terminology, but Warlock's a good guy that very innocently wants to help people and is a good guy in Excalibur, but this disease and this weird techno-organic flesh that takes over everything looks exactly like it does in Star Trek. It's all these machine and computer parts that just wraps itself over the real. In Transformers, the Decepticons fly around in there's the Allspark cube, and then the relationship is with the Decepticons that want to assimilate and take over things in a way that Terminator does. And there's many other examples in other types of fiction.
Yeah, well, I guess sort of going back again for a moment there to the robots. I think a lot of, well, it starts arguably with Data in Next Gen, but I think a lot of that idea of robots as servants and what is the purpose of a robot and what do we do with technology goes back to like Isaac Asimov's and his robot short stories and his 5 laws of robotics, which were laid down in some of those early stories. I know there's one Asimov story which is very much of the 50s, I think, and it's a housewife who's left at home and she's got nothing to do, so she gets herself a robot servant who starts doing all the housework for her. And all of a sudden, she's been freed from having to do the housework. So what's she going to do with herself now? And it's sort of ethics, really, and with the synths in Picard, as they're portrayed, certainly at the end of the series, they have this. Maybe it's just down to the gold face paint that they put on them, which is like a weird echo of Brent Spiner's Data, but they have this veneer of sort of Greco-Roman antiquity about them, like they're always made to look like statues. So it is that thing of positing what a very far future culture would be like, and essentially it's the same as the much more advanced cultures of antiquity.
And in Doctor Who, you have. See, the thing is with Doctor Who, I was watching it, I mean, ever since I was a kid, and when I got into these sync themes and ideas, I was like, well, the representation of all these ideas within Doctor Who is clearly the dialect, but the only thing missing is the hybridization. You have the techno part, you don't have the organic in techno-organic, and then I watched this episode where they show the real origin and makeup of the dialects, and they actually have this organic little tiny being living within the cyber structure of the dialect. So there's nowhere where you can find this story with all of its morals without. Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, the Daleks were originally created as they were survivors of a post-apocalyptic war, and because of mutation, they had to adapt and put themselves into.
I mean, it kind of depends which one, but I can't remember the name of it now. I think it was the Day of the Daleks or something. But essentially, they have been genetically modified by Devros or whatever his name was from the race that they had been into the new species that became the Daleks. That was within the, because really what you see in the outside, the exterior of the Daleks is essentially a suit of armor, more or less, that these small organic beings operate from within, so to speak. But this was all brought out from genetic modification and that kind of experimentation.
And that whole idea about being the mutated product of endless war, which then has to take on techno-organic or artificial properties to survive, is an echo of the idea of Atlantis having a battle with Mars and the sort of moral spiel that the Greys are always giving us in abduction literature, that they were at one point like us or had a much bigger physical natural mass, and then through constant nuclear bombardment and the worshipping of technology, the externalization of technology which already exists within our physiology, like psychic powers, being ignored until it's kind of this war-based thing where you forget your own inner potential and you seek the external, the tools and the technology, and then get obsessed with that because you're in a time of war and you're desperately looking for the bigger and larger weapon. And that moral may lie within World War II and nuking Japan as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're mentioning Doctor Who there. In the most recent Doctor Who, like the very last few episodes, that interestingly enough, they were airing at about the same time as Picard was coming out, at least in the UK, and that featured the return of the Cybermen, who I'm pretty sure were kind of the influence for the Borg in Star Trek, because in a lot of ways they're the same sort of thing. They are this post-human advanced, they've gone beyond flesh and they're now part machine.
I think there was even kind of a reference of that in Picard, where the one lady who was she talked about she had studied advanced cybernetics or something like that at the Daystrom Institute. But yes, I mean there was that kind of, I think maybe even more than once they had linked cybernetics to the study of this kind of stuff that you were seeing with the synthetic life forms and what have you, which I definitely think was kind of a direct nod to the Cybermen, which were also kind of an interpretation of some of the cybernetic theories that were being bannered about in the 60s and so forth.
And I just have to mention that similarly in the X-Men world, that obsession with embracing the external is the idea that the mutants and the good guy, or just all the mutants within the X-Men mythology, would be searching inwardly or for a natural mutation to bring us to a superhuman level of potential, but the government fears that so much that they create robots who eventually turn on them, but initially to hunt down those mutants and destroy them. So again, once it comes to war and desperation and sort of working entirely out of your own fear instead of your own innate potential, they develop master mold in the Sentinels, and soon that becomes a problem for everyday humans, not just the mutants they were targeting.
So sort of in relation to all of that, really, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the culture novels of Iain Banks or not.
No.
But
Sorry,
I was
no.
no, well, I was reminded of them a lot because in those novels, you know, Iain Banks depicts uh, a sort of a pseudo Star Trek like post scarcity sort of socialist technocratic universe, which to some degree works as something of a sort of sly parody of Star Trek's universe, maybe. Because in those novels, you have a collection of humanoid races who are spacefaring, and this is somewhere in the far distant future. And they're ruled by benevolent AIs, and you know, artificial intelligences exist, and they are treated exactly like people. And you know, no one has to work. Everyone in this culture lives in perfect health for centuries, and they do have a, similar to the Prime Directive, they have a policy of non-interference in primitive cultures. But at the same time, Iain Banks sort of undercuts all this by characterizing this society as essentially corrupt, and that they really are imperialist conquerors. They do meddle with other cultures, they run dirty tricks campaigns, they instigate proxy wars, and they sort of interfere and destabilize societies to their own ends. And that is kind of what you're seeing in the Picard series as well. It's the idea of what happens when we take technology to a level that it's the supposed singularity and everything will be perfect, illness will be wiped out, so we will, you know, everybody will be equal, there will be no underclasses anymore. And what happens when that happens? You know, how does that then come back around? And is that necessarily a sustainable system, you know, hypothetically?
Yeah.
Which is kind of ironic too, with a lot of the, you know, the anti-woke criticism of the show coming from right-wing quarters and so forth. Because I mean, in a lot of ways, the show is essentially depicting the decline of this socialist utopia. But obviously, the subtleties of that were lost on many such viewers of that capacity. So let's see here. I think there's probably one other big thing we should probably pick up here. Colin, did you have anything else that you want to go over beforehand?
No, absolutely no.
Well, I think the one thing, though, probably a lot of people be interested to hear would be speculation on whether or not this also plays into the whole mythos of the Nine. Of course, you know, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, there's been a lot of evidence that's come out in recent years that Gene Roddenberry had got caught up in the whole saga of the Nine. It's a rather elaborate one, but essentially going back into the early 50s, around 52, 53, there were two seances that were held. First one was by a guy named Adrena Puharich, who would go on to become an artichoke scientist during those glorious behavioral modification experiments and so forth. And his close companion, Dr. Arthur Young, who was the inventor of the Bell helicopter. And they did two seances in this period. The second one was also attended by a lot of Ivy League blue blood families, the Astors, the DuPonts, and all of that. And they were allegedly contacted by an advanced alien species that initially had alluded to being the personification of the Grand Enid from the ancient Egyptian pantheon and so forth.
And I laid all
though,
that out in the intro, but you guys can look at our other episodes for more details on that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Stephen.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. But anyway, you know, what exactly the Nine were changed over the years and so on and so forth. And eventually kind of getting into the 70s with the publication of Yuri, there was this concept that the Nine were actually an intelligence in a spaceship. I think it was called Spectra or something like that was floating around the Earth, and that they were these beings from outside of time and space and so forth. Essentially they have been able to transcend even the dimensions themselves. And there's been a lot of echoes of this throughout the Star Trek franchise. Certainly, I think really getting into the shows in the 80s and the 90s with the Q Continuum, and then later the Prophets from DS9 and so on and so forth. And certainly I was really curious about that with Picard as well, if they were going to bring these representations of the Nine back. Certainly, I haven't really seen much of Discovery, so I don't know if there's an echo of that in Discovery, but you don't really see much of this in the new movies, and the impression I'd gotten is there really wasn't much done with it in Enterprise for that matter either. So I had been very curious if they were going to try to bring the Nine back. It certainly seems like it would be a good time for them to return, since they do have a tendency to appear in times of great social upheaval, which certainly the latter parts of this past decade would constitute as such. And yes, I mean, I do think we can see echoes of that in Picard. Of course, we hear what essentially the core of the prophecy that the Romulans are being, working off of, is that there is this extremely advanced species of synthetic life forms that have a federation that transcends multiple galaxies, and effectively that they do now exist outside of time and space. And the synthetics that are depicted in Picard at these utopian community we've been, talking about, are able to witness the prophecy through one of the characters doing a variation of the Vulcan mind meld. And there's a message in this prophecy that essentially tells them that they can open a portal up to allow these very advanced synthetic life forms to come through, and they will essentially wipe out organic life in the galaxy as we know it. And unfortunately, I suppose it should be rather fortunate, but it is an interesting plot device, and we don't really get to see very much of it by the end of Picard. But what we do see is very enticing. The portal comes open, and we see some tendrils coming out, also kind of alluding a bit to the Lovecraftian great old ones and so forth. But it is an interesting development. Yes, D-Wave as well.
D-Wave and Elon Musk's, their very descriptions are the old ones coming through a portal via quantum AI. I'm sorry, please go on.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, there is a lot of this, kind of echo of this, of course, kind of in our first, couple of episodes when we were rebooting the farm. I mean, we went into this a lot in depth, this whole sort of concept that AI was being used to create these, Lovecraftian old ones and so forth. So it's really interesting that, I mean, it does play into a lot of these concepts, and it also does seem to kind of wrap all of this back around to the notion of the Nine, which, I think Chris Knowles has pretty compellingly displayed in The Secret Sun over the course of, a couple of series, but most notably The Secret Star Trek. The Nine have been a presence in Star Trek really since the beginning, certainly in the newer series in the 80s and 90s, and I do think we're starting to see a return of them, and I do think it will be very interesting going into the second season if they do, build on this potentially. But I was curious, Colin, what's your take on all of that?
Yeah, that did. Yeah, I mean, I was just about to mention that when you were saying about this, the sort of the synthetic AI above the synthetic AI, which, it does feel a little bit thrown in right at the end as something of a sort of a Deus Ex Machina. But at the same, it's got those hints of Lovecraftian sort of intelligences coming from some place beyond time. And it will be interesting to see, because a second series is definitely happening at some point, and I'm assuming they'll pick up on that in the next series and see where we go with that sort of thing. I mean, I'm also sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, well, we can only hope so. I mean, it would certainly be quite disappointing if they do not address that going into the second season, certainly.
So you guys want to wrap it up? Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add about the series? Surely we'll be doing more on Star Trek in the future, but...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean...
No,
that's most, I think we've covered most of it, yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think we've covered most of the bases as well. But certainly, I mean, it is a very good show. If you've been holding out and watching it, I feel pretty confident in saying it's the best Star Trek franchise since at least the Enterprise Voyager years, maybe even since DS9. It is really good. And, I'm speaking as a guy who really despised Discovery and was not especially impressed by the newer movies either. So, yeah, I was very reluctant going into this, and I was very pleasantly surprised. It really turned, the Star Trek franchise on its head. It didn't just, try to do a slavish imitation of Next Generation or the original series. They did do some genuinely new things with this, and they really showed us, I think, a very different side of the Star Trek universe that, I mean, I guess maybe we got hints of it here and there in DS9, but certainly it's never been explored to the extent that it is in Picard, especially without everything being seen through the prism of Starfleet. I mean, all the shows are almost on Starfleet ships, based around Starfleet officers. Even DS9, it's largely seen through the prism of Starfleet officers. So, yes, here we still have former Starfleet officers, but it is much more of, I'd say, a civilian take on, a universe that previously we'd only really seen through this kind of militaristic worldview.
yeah, and for anyone interested in the Nine's message, as I said, check our other shows where we talk about sci-fi or the Nine specifically within the context of Lavenda's work, but don't overlook the Star Trek cartoon, which I see as just as integral and important as the original series as far as how much almost every episode touches on some, theme from the Nine, and it's just a great series. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for listening. And everybody have a good day. Thanks, you guys, for joining me. Bye bye.